Hi everyone, this is Toby from the International Association for Political Science Students. We are here live from the annual convention of the International Studies Association, and with me here right now is Ana Alecsandru. I'm very happy to have you here.
Thank you, Toby. Thank you for the invitation.
You're welcome. And I directly want to go into what you're researching right now. You're researching emotions in the realm of nuclear arms agreements. What do you mean when you say you research about emotions?
So I'm not researching emotions per se. I think that trust has not been analyzed in international relations with a focus on the more effective side. So I'm trying to incorporate that in my research. I think that so far the way trust has been analyzed has been in a very positivist way, almost devoid of any emotions. Trust is literally just there to explain a very rational actor way of looking at things, and I'm trying to add on all the body of research by incorporating other dimensions, by looking at the more emotional turn in international relations.
What exactly is this non-positivist view looking like?
So I actually think that, or at least this is the argument in my research, that trust has been analyzed by looking at very momentary decisions without incorporating things like the social and cultural background to decisions. And I think trust has a temporal dimension, which is not really considered. So I'm looking at trust as a process. So I'm studying it longitudinally by looking at case studies of arms control, like bilateral cases of nuclear arms control, and by looking at how decisions are actually influenced by other factors, by diplomatic interactions, because I'm looking at the diplomatic interactions between leaders and policymakers. So I'm trying to capture the more human aspect that has been left aside in strategic studies.
So you've just mentioned leaders in this context. Who are, because I think this is one of the problems or challenges you might face in this research. Who are the actors in this analysis?
This is actually very interesting. I've just finished a panel presentation, and of course the levels of analysis are always going to be a very important debate in international relations. The way I'm trying to bridge that divide is by using a narrative approach. And trying to analyze the key narratives that take into account the factors that relate to why an agreement has been concluded. And working my way back from there, I'll try to see which moments have been, I call them leaps of trust. So decisions that have the three key elements of trust: vulnerability, risk, and positive expectations. So when I look at those leap of trust, I will look at also the context. So what's happened before and what happened after the leap. And I compare the narratives from after the leap with the narratives from before. And I'll try and see where the changes map onto changes in the actual outcomes of the agreement.
Do you describe trust as something that at a certain point in time, for example, is the same for any actor? Or I can imagine that the level of trust is different for different actors in the same point of time. How's this working?
So first of all, I'll start by saying that trust is a fascinating concept. It means different things to different people. And the way researchers should analyze it is contextual. You always have to look at your research question and try and understand what trust adds to you in that particular context. And I think in my case, in nuclear arms control, there's a lot of talk about trust and distrust. And we don't really look at what exactly it means. So to a certain extent, we're not systematically analyzing it. And I'm not trying to discard the entire body of research in international relations on trust, but I'm just trying to add to that by saying there's a lot of research outside the international relations field that can add to the very, when I say positivist, I'm literally meaning we don't really look at how context impacts on the concept. And what you meant with mentioning the importance of the levels, that's also important for trust, because if you have your research question that looks at the level of the states and how you want to build more trust between states, then of course that's going to impact on how you will analyze trust. So I think that the way a researcher should analyze trust is by starting with the research question and seeing the added value of the concept to your research question.
What was your last empirical subject that you studied in this matter?
Yeah, you're referring to a case study in my PhD. So at the moment, I'm just looking at the most recent case study, the new STAR treaty.
Okay. And can you tell us a bit about it? What are the characteristics about it, and what is different or what is particular about this one?
Well, I think first of all, the case study of the New START treaty is fascinating, because there hasn't been much academic work on this particular case study, and given that it is the most recent one, and it's also it's a timely topic, given that there are still discussions about extending or whether it will be extended. I'm trying to add to that by looking at the diplomatic interactions between Obama and Medvedev, and how those interactions impacted on how the agreement was shaped. So I'm literally taking a step back, and I'm not looking at what happened after the agreement was concluded, but at how trust and the narratives of cooperation with the themes of trust impacted on how the actual negotiations developed.
I can imagine that when you do research on it and present it, talk about it, that your research is a very alternative, or seen as a very alternative approach, thinking about the realm of non-proliferation, and research on security is very dominated by neo-realist literature. Do you think that your work is following an entirely different approach, or do you feel that your literature, your research adds upon what is studied in positivist terms, especially realist?
So you're right. Actually, strategic studies in general as a field has been dominated by a very rational way of analyzing trust in particular, because this is what I'm looking at. And because of that, I'm trying to, I wouldn't say it's, of course it's got elements of originality, it's a PhD project, but there is a body of research that I am drawing on. I can say of course, my supervisor, my lead supervisor, Professor Nicholas Wheeler, has been an influence on my project, because he's been working on the role of trust in international relations for, I think, more than 10 years now. In terms of what I'm contributing, I think, to the field, is that I'm literally trying to study trust as a process and not just as a decision, and also incorporating the more effective dimensions. And with narratives, I think I am trying to look at the more, or let's say both effective and cognitive dimensions of trust.
Has this interest been the same throughout the last years? I know that you wrote your master thesis on the Cuban Missile Crisis and did not concentrate on trust, but on empathy. Yeah. Was it the same idea, or what motivated you there?
So yes, I mean, I'm interested in the emotional turn in international relations purely because, and again, this is a personal interest, I think the way we're studying strategic arms control in particular is in a very instrumental, technical, rational, devoid of any emotions way. I started with empathy during the Cuban Missile Crisis because there is some research, especially the policymakers during the Cuban Missile Crisis, mentioned the importance of empathy in preventing a nuclear war. And that has led to trust, because there is actually research on how empathy is a key component that leads to trust. And even in my research at the moment, I can actually highlight how there are moments when empathy is actually a key component to how some what I call leaps of trust take place. So emotions are there. I think they permeate every diplomatic negotiations. And I'm not saying I'm going to reinvent the wheel, but the moment we have more researchers talking about these aspects, then we're definitely going to push the field.
I'm curious, what are the sources that you use when you try to figure out where empathy is at work? Because I feel, especially in the Cuban Missile Crisis, we're talking about diplomats sitting in a room, and there's not much information going out. And I can also imagine that the protocols are not having written down the empathy or the emotions that people had. What are the sources there?
So this is quite interesting because I have a side project that's literally just starting, but it is drawing on my master's dissertation on empathy during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And first of all, it's important to have the materials available. And the reason why there's so much work on the Cuban Missile Crisis is because you have so many materials that have been declassified. Hence, it's a limitation of the field, but you will use whatever you can get hold of to make your argument. I mean, ideally, it would be good to have more recent case studies to look at the negotiations, so the diplomatic interactions. But with that particular case study, I'm actually developing a method drawing on Lynn Cameron's, it's called metaphor-led discourse analysis. And she is a linguist, and she has a model outside our field. But with the emotional turn, one of the key aspects is to try and use methods from outside the field to look at these elements, in this case emotions, that have not really been examined. And of course, there's a reason why they haven't been examined, because it's very, very difficult to look at emotions. But again, I think that by using new methodologies and the way Professor Lynn Cameron is using empathy in her model could be a way, and at least that's what I'm trying to do in this new paper, of analyzing empathy by looking literally at the discourse analysis.
What is your goal through this research? Do you feel that analyzing and adding this dimension of emotions is what you aspire, or do you feel that what you analyze and what you find out may contribute to advice to politicians of how to work in certain situations?
So there are two kind of questions that you've asked. One also refers to my personal interests. Yes, everything that happens within the emotional turn in international relations, I find it fascinating, maybe because that's I'm not persuaded by how strategic study as a field has been studied so far, but also I'm always driven by the research question. And in the case of my PhD project, it is about how trust and distrust, these two concepts keep popping up, but we don't really know exactly what they mean, or they haven't really been studied contextually to understand the role trust has on whatever it is the focus of your research. In terms of the actual advice for policymakers, yes, I hope that by analyzing my 3 case studies, I will have some conclusions in terms of how diplomatic interactions have an impact on the outcome of an agreement. And even that, a particular field, so diplomacy and the way diplomatic interactions impact on negotiations, I think that's a field that so far has been kind of left aside or even seen as a subfield of international relations. And I think that's a pity, because diplomacy is, at least in my opinion, what makes negotiations have an impact on the structural factors.
Let's drop on this and talk more about actors. And we can right now observe that key countries in world politics cut down diplomacy in terms of State Department or foreign ministry efforts.
United States in particular.
For example, yeah, and thereby kind of cutting themselves off at one like one essential branch of diplomacy. From what you've studied till now and researched, is there a result that suggests that certain institutions or actors are better in trust building, or are better in creating or retrieving trust than others?
I think it's communication and dialogue in general will lead to trust building, because we're human beings, and that's how trust is communicated. I mean, of course, that could be in international relations considered as cheap talk, but when we actually talk about diplomatic negotiations, or what happens behind closed doors, that's exactly what helps not necessarily resolve a situation, but at least clarify the issues that are important for further negotiations to happen. So when you kind of remove that level of diplomatic talks, I think that will have an impact on any further potential improvement of the relationship. So, for instance, if you take the most recent case with North Korea, it is very interesting to see that after all the discussions that nothing will take place, now there is this element of a summit will take place. So, and of course there's all the discussion around the summit itself and how that could be a breakthrough. So again, you can see their diplomacy in action.
I know that your interest into emotions in this field also comes from practical experience that you can draw upon. So can you tell us a bit how these practical experiences came along with what you then later studied?
My background is in international relations all the way. During my undergraduate degree, I became interested in the more, let's say, the nuclear world. And then I actually started looking at the role of emotions in international relations during my first master's, when I started working with now my PhD supervisor, Professor Wheeler. The actual academic literature has been very useful in kind of triggering my own interest, but then also the fact that I've had two really interesting internships. One was at NATO in Brussels, and one was in New York with the United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs. And what I took away from these two experiences was that diplomatic interactions and the talk behind closed door matters. It's just that we don't really have the access to try and understand what happens with these interactions. And I know that is a limitation in my research or in anyone's research, but I think that by looking at all the material that has been classified in some case studies or with interviews with the more recent diplomats, we can try and push the field and understand how the actual human aspect has a role in diplomacy.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
That was a really nice talk. I'm glad that you took the time talking to us about your current research.
Thank you very much.
And about your motivations behind your research. And have a nice day here, I say.
You too. Bye.